And we continue the Newsmaker now with Alfred University history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Just before we went on, I was talking to Dr. Ostrower on the phone, and I said, I hope you don't end this interview as abruptly as last night's White House press conference was ended, or I'm going to be reading out of the phone book or something.
Well, I said if I end the interview like that, I'll simply throw the phone against the wall. I guess that'll be the end of me. I saw the press conference, or at least I saw that portion of the press conference that you're referring to, and it just continues to amaze me that you got a president who I do not think is really fit for the office, in part because, you know, if you are in a public office, I say this, I was the mayor of Alfred, New York, you know, and for the period that I was mayor, I took plenty of criticism for one thing or another. You got to have a reasonably thick skin. We have a president who has a very, very thin skin, and I think it's because he has a kind of malignant narcissism. He has what they call narcissistic syndrome, personality syndrome, and that's not a very good thing because he's unable to accept criticism. But I think more troubling from my perspective is that even when things are not critical, he views them as critical. So let's take a look at what happened yesterday afternoon. A Chinese-American reporter, this woman was raised in the United States. She's a United States citizen. She lived in West Virginia, I think, for just about her entire life. But she asked a question. She said, why? And remember, the president had, if you were watching the press conference yesterday, you would have noticed a sign, two large signs actually, that said something along the lines of, America has done more testing than any other country. And she said, Mr. President, why are you so concerned with the competition between the United States and other countries when so many people are still dying in the United States and so many people are still contracting the disease? It was a fair question. You know, it wasn't an easy question, but it was certainly a fair question. And he then attacked her, and he attacked her. He said, if you want an answer to that question, why don't you ask the Chinese? Well, that's not that may be a response, but it's certainly not a genuine answer to the question. And then she said, well, why are you attacking me? Why are you saying this to me? And the implication was, I think very, very clearly, he was saying it to her because she was of Chinese descent, because she was, ethnically Chinese. Well, he should have simply answered the question, and he could have answered if he wanted. I don't think he did have a reasonable answer, which is maybe one reason why he simply ducked the whole thing. And then he called on someone else, a reporter from CNN. And she hesitated. And she hesitated because she knew that the American Chinese reporter who had just asked the question and who had just been attacked, wanted to follow it up. And then when the CNN reporter said, well, it wasn't a nasty question. I mean, I think that she did exactly what other reporters should do. In other words, she defended the press. She defended the right of a free press to ask, questions, even if they tend to be somewhat critical questions. And Trump then simply turned around and he stormed out of the press conference. He was like a toddler. He was like a small child who didn't have a response and therefore, just allowed his emotions to get the best of him. Well, we've seen a lot of this, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot more as things get even more and more tense as we get toward the election. Among the things that's happening right now is that his general poll numbers, I think, are remaining, fairly intact. The most recent poll, the CNN poll, said about 45% of the public still believes that he's doing a good job. All right, maybe 55% do not believe that, but 45% is pretty consistent with where it has been over the last 3 years or so. But what is also happening this year is that many of the senatorial races are not as favorable for many of the Republicans who have remained very, very supportive of the president. That is going to be troublesome for the administration because if the Senate does become Democratic, if the Senate becomes Democratic in the election of 2020, it means that many of his of his judicial appointments will not be approved. It will also probably mean that there will be additional scrutiny of the administration, additional investigations of the administration, and I think that that's going to put the president under a lot of pressure. Probably is already putting him under a good deal of pressure. But in either case, I thought that yesterday's press conference was just about as remarkable as any that I have ever seen.
Same here. I didn't the volume on the TV that I was watching it on was a little low, so I did not catch what the reporter said, and that part of it, and I was talking to someone at the same time, so I kind of missed what happened there. But back to the press conference situation, Dr. Ostrower. Don't you think, though, that the reporters are a little tougher on Trump than previous presidents? I can remember the Reagan press conferences as a kid, and I thought they were tough on Reagan, but I think they're even harder on Trump. Don't you think that the reporters, in many cases, try to bait him to lose his cool in some ways?
No, I really don't. And I think that the reporters are doing exactly what reporters should do. That's what we do with a free press. If you don't want a free press, you're going to get you're going to get softball questions that are going to be posed at the president. I don't think the reporters are doing any more with this president than they were doing with Obama or they were doing with Clinton, especially during the Monica Lewinsky thing and so forth. The press has always been critical. And if you go all the way back to George Washington, you go all the way back to Thomas Jefferson, you're going to find presidents have complained about the press. Franklin Roosevelt often found the press to be, from his perspective, overly critical. Harry Truman sometimes did not even want to talk to reporters. He said at one point of a reporter, "I want to punch him in the nose."
Wasn't that the guy that gave a critical review of Truman's daughter as a piano player?
That's correct. You got a good memory. President Johnson felt that the press over the Vietnam War was exceedingly critical, but the press wasn't critical. They were critical on one level. They were asking good critical questions, but when the administration, say over Vietnam, was feeding them information that was simply not true, when General Westmoreland would stand before Congress and say, "We see light at the end of the tunnel in 1967. We think the troops will be home fairly soon." Well, the reporters knew that wasn't true, and should they therefore not ask a critical question? Nixon obviously felt that the press was very, very critical. Jimmy Carter felt that the press was much too critical. So I don't think that there's any reason for this president to be especially thin-skinned about this. On the other hand, this president, has publicly attacked the press in a way that no other president, not Jefferson, not Lincoln, not any other president has ever done. When he calls the press enemies of the people, that's pretty strong language. And if you're a member of the press, I would think that you might take a little bit of your eyes ought to open up on that kind of a thing. What's really going on here? Because from my perspective, again, as a historian, I don't know that this president has any real respect for the Constitution, and I don't know that he's ever actually read carefully the Constitution. You've heard me say before, Brian, that this is a president who says that his favorite article is Article number 12. Well, which would be great if there was an Article number 12. Of course, there is none. And so that respect for the First Amendment of free speech, of a free press, which means a critical press. I don't think that this president has that kind of respect for the Constitution or for a free press, and I think it comes out at the press conferences, and I think yesterday was a good example of that.
Yes, we'll just have to agree to disagree that the press is harder on Trump, or are they? Dr. Ostrower, in your answer, you mentioned LBJ and the media. Do you want to get into this day in history a little bit early? We can get back to current events, but do you mind if I ask you a question about LBJ?
Before I do want to say, okay. If you don't mind, I'd like to just note what I consider to be the most important thing that happened this week, which was not, Trump's touting about all the testing that we're doing and so forth. I wanted to say something about what happened with the Department of Justice, because I think there's a real historical element to this, and then I'd be happy to go to this day in history.
Sure.
But what happened with the Department of Justice, as I think most of you know, is that I believe it was on Friday, I'm not even sure which day, maybe Saturday, the president, the Department of Justice said that they are dropping the case against Michael Flynn, against General Flynn, a case that has been in the works now for over 3 years. Flynn had been appointed by the president as the head of the National Security Council. That's the chief foreign policy arm in the White House itself, and you have two foreign policy locuses of power in the United States, one in the State Department and the other in the National Security Council. It was a position for which I think Flynn was very, very ill-equipped. As a matter of fact, there were many, many people in the Pentagon who felt that he never should have been appointed to that thing. But in either case, he was. But in that capacity, we discovered that in leading up to his appointment, he had lied about a series of meetings that he had, a series of conversations that he had with the Russian ambassador, whose name was Kislyak. Flynn, this is even before the inauguration, had talked to Kislyak about removing the sanctions that the United States had imposed against the Russians. Flynn said, number one, that he didn't have the conversations, and then finally when he was confronted about the conversations, he said that he never talked about the sanctions. Both of those things were lies. And he not only lied to the president, to the vice president when he was asked very specific about this, but he also lied to a congressional group. And when you lie over that sort of thing, that's a federal crime. More importantly, he lied to FBI officials who were vetting him. Well, when you lie to FBI officials, that is also a crime, okay? That's also a crime. And so he was confronted with this. He lost his position. He then was tried. And twice during the period when he was being investigated and being tried for all this, he admitted what he had done. In other words, he admitted that he had lied. And yet the president is saying that he's completely innocent, that there's no crime there whatsoever, that he is, and this is the president said just within the last 48 hours, that he is a hero. And I just find it just astounding, just depressing as can be, that the president would treat the Department of Justice in the way in which the Department of Justice is operating right now. Almost 2,000 former members of the Department of Justice. And I'm talking about officials who had been appointed during the Reagan administration, the Clinton administration, George Bush's administration, Bush II's administration, Obama's administration, almost 2,000 officials. And these people, for the most part, are not political. They are highly professional. They are very, very well trained. This is an awfully impressive group of people. And they said the following. They issued a statement. And the statement included the following term. It said, make no mistake. The Department's action, the Department of Justice's action, in other words, in dropping charges against Flynn, is extraordinarily rare, if not unprecedented. If any of us, or anyone reading this statement who is not a friend of the president, if any of us were to lie to federal investigators in the course of a properly predicated counterintelligence investigation and admit we did so under oath, we would be prosecuted for it. And the point that these guys are making, that these 2,000 officials are making, is that Attorney General Barr is essentially turning the Department of Justice into an arm of the presidency, into a kind of personal defense organization for the President of the United States. After Watergate, during the 1970s, the Department of Justice was in some ways reformed, and there was a degree of independence that was established between the White House on one hand and the Department of Justice, so that everyone, and I really mean everyone, would be treated fairly under the law. If we're not all treated fairly under the law, then we do not have the rule of law in the United States of America. And right now, what we're finding out is that the Department of Justice is treating the friends of the president in one fashion and everybody else in another fashion. And I might add, Brian, that if they can protect the friends of the president, they can prosecute and persecute those who that the president believes are not his friends at all, are his critics. And I think that there's plenty to worry about, plenty to be concerned about.
I wanted to bring up this point, Dr. Ostrower. Conservatives often argue that General Michael Flynn was nailed on process crimes by the feds, that Flynn was questioned endlessly, tripped up on minor points, and then charged with lying. What would you say to that argument?
I think it's BS. I've looked at this fairly carefully. What the FBI, that's really what you're referring to here. There was an FBI investigation of Flynn, and it was properly conducted. Now look, you're going to hear from the president, and you're going to hear from Barr, and you're going to hear from Sean Hannity and Rush Limbaugh and so forth, that it was unfair. Well, that's their line. That's their propaganda line. But in fact, there was nothing unfair about it. And I might add that there is a Justice Department official, an assistant attorney general. We're talking about someone near the very, very top. Her name is Mary McLeod. And she said as recently as the day before yesterday that the attorney general, I'm talking about Barr, that the attorney general took her words and twisted them around to make it sound as if the FBI investigation was unfair. That is not what she said, and she was extremely clear about it. And yesterday in the New York Times, if you want to read about this, she wrote an op-ed in her own words to make very, very clear that, in fact, the investigation was a fair and proper investigation.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a moment with Dr. Gary Ostrower.
The Ryan Agencies, your local, independent insurance agencies. The Ryan Agency employs 15 of your friends and neighbors. They live, shop, and support our community. When you buy insurance from the Ryan Agency, you support local families. Contact the Ryan Agencies today, your local source for all things insurance.
Insurance protection you can rely on. The Ryan Agency.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carolyn, who says, what do you say for today, Rob?
I say lots of sunshine for a good part of the day, Brian. It's looking pretty good out there this morning, just a little on the chilly side. A lot of us starting out this morning at or below freezing, but at least we're starting out with a lot of sunshine. Some cloudiness in the Mohawk Valley this morning out towards Albany, some cloudiness to our south down over Pennsylvania. That was actually over us during the night, and it has shifted to the south and east. Looks like overall we're mostly sunny this morning, and then we turn partly sunny this afternoon. Some clouds that I can see out towards Lake Erie and Michigan are going to head our way later today. Brian, we're breezy and cool, 45 to 50. Sunrise was at 5:50 this morning. It sets tonight at 8:23. We're clear, we're cold tonight. If you're a backyard gardener, keep the plants inside or cover them up again. 25 to 30 overnight, so we get a hard freeze yet again. Lots of sun, we're close to 55 tomorrow. Partly cloudy, not quite as cold tomorrow night, 35. We'll continue to warm up through Thursday. We also cloud up on Thursday with the chance of some late day showers. Highs Thursday afternoon, Brian, somewhere between 60 and 65.
Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, we referenced President Johnson earlier in the media call. LBJ met the president of Vietnam, Diem, in 1961. I had a question on that, and this is what I referenced earlier in the interview. Did that visit to Vietnam, where LBJ praised Diem as the Churchill of Asia, did that have any effect on Lyndon Johnson wanting to keep America in the Vietnam War?
I don't know that it had an effect on it. I think that the same kind of thinking that would have led Johnson to say that President Diem was the Churchill of Asia was similar to the kind of thinking that led Johnson to escalate the war after he became president following the assassination of John Kennedy. John Kennedy, by November of 1963, number one, had come to recognize that Diem was anything but the Churchill of Asia. Diem was presiding over a regime that was very, very corrupt, and I might add that I don't know that there was any evidence that Diem himself was corrupt, but the people around him and the people he appointed to office, both civil offices as well as military offices, were exceedingly corrupt, so corrupt that essentially the popular support for the regime had virtually evaporated by November of 1963. And it was for that reason that Kennedy was willing to allow the CIA to cooperate with some of the South Vietnamese generals to get rid of Diem. Kennedy did not know that Diem would be assassinated.
That was one of my questions, Dr. Ostrower, because I've read conflicting reports on Kennedy either being shocked or Kennedy coldly going along with the general's plans to kill Diem. I'm glad you brought that up.
No, well, I don't think there's any question today. Kennedy was shocked when he was turned white when he heard that Diem had been assassinated. But more importantly than just that, Kennedy was at least considering the possibility of reducing the number of Americans in Vietnam. He was coming to believe, in other words, that much of the information he was getting from the Department of Defense was simply not accurate, that we were in fact losing when I say we, the South Vietnamese government was really losing the war rather than winning the war. When he was assassinated, and by the way, he did announce that we would reduce the troops by 1,000. There were about 16,000 troops there at the time. Maybe that was because it would be the first part of what would be a more general removal of American troops, or maybe it was simply to shock the Vietnamese government, the South Vietnamese government, into recognizing that they had to really step up. But in either case, when Johnson became president, he reversed course. What he did essentially was to increase, and I mean sharply increase, the amount of support that the U.S. was giving to the South Vietnamese. And so in some ways, I think what he did after November of 1963 was very consistent with what he said in April of 1961 when he had visited Vietnam and then came back, as I say, and called Diem the Churchill of Asia.
Down the last couple of minutes with Dr. Ostrower on this day in history. 1932, the tragic incident of the Charles Lindbergh's baby was found. The baby had been kidnapped and was found dead. And this day in history, 1932. Charles Lindbergh, of course, the 1920s pilot hero, later fell out of favor with America for opposing World War II. A couple of interesting things I was reading up on Lindbergh. One, Lindbergh tried to enlist in World War II after Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt put the blocks to it, it said. Two, Lindbergh actually had a father who was a congressman named August Lindbergh, who opposed World War I. I didn't know either of those things, Gary.
Yeah, no, his father was a congressman from Minnesota. Lindbergh came from a pretty prominent family. When he flew across the Atlantic alone in 1927, he became a hero in a way I think it's fair to say that no other single individual in world history had ever become a hero. He had a ticker tape parade in New York City where about 5 million people showed up to cheer him on. And remember, our population was a heck of a lot smaller back in that period than it would be, let's say, today. I think it's worth noting that a number of people, quite a number of people, had flown across the Atlantic before Lindbergh, but no one had done it alone. No one had done it as that so-called lone eagle. And by the same token, he was an attractive guy. He was relatively young. I think he was only 24 years old. He was very articulate. He was kind of modest. He would never refer to, say, I flew across the Atlantic. He would say, we flew across the Atlantic. And by the first person plural, he was referring to himself and his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. By the same token, when the baby was kidnapped in 1932 by a German immigrant by the name of Bruno Hauptmann, it became an international story. The trial of Hauptmann became one of the great trials of the 20th century, and Hauptmann was eventually convicted. I knew the prosecuting attorney in that case. I knew him when I was in high school.
Wow.
His name was David Willens, and he became eventually the Attorney General of New Jersey when he prosecuted Bruno Hauptmann. Unfortunately, Lindbergh, by 1940, was kind of sympathetic to the Nazis. He accepted awards from the Nazi government. He became the head of what was called America First. You might think about that name for a moment. America First, which was an isolationist organization trying to keep the United States from involvement in World War II. And after we did enter the war, in a way, Lindbergh had really been discredited, and that's one of the reasons why FDR refused to allow Lindbergh to join the Air Force. So he had a very checkered career. One other point I'd make about Lindbergh, He was considered, as I say, a great hero by by millions and millions of people. But when it came to his wife, he was not considered a great hero. He was one of the most unfaithful human beings, one of the most unfaithful husbands that I think the United States produced during the 20th century. I think that Donald Trump would have a lot of admiration for him.
Gosh. What a zing. All right, with that, Dr. Ostrower, we have to go. I'm glad you did not throw the phone against the wall.
Brian, thank you very much for the interview.
Thanks, Gary. Talk to you next week. AM 1480 WLEA Hornell, 106.9 FM also is where we're heard.